Comprehensive plans are all about community, and each of your cities has its own character, its own vision, its own direction. AWC developed a series of short videos to help you prepare your GMA update. Each video contains a few key concepts and conversation starters that you can relate to your community. This segment looks at GMA, SEPA, and the environmental landscape.
The capital facilities plan element really makes the rest of the plan a reality. In fact, that was the title of the guide that the state commissioned me to write back in the early 90s, helping cities figure out how to do capital facilities planning. And specifically, the connections that it makes within the plan are first, all the growth information from the land use element and the level of service information from the other elements like utilities and transportation and parks. All that information comes together to help figure out what a city needs in terms of infrastructure, which is a buzzword for police stations and roads and parks and water and sewer lines. And then after you know what that need is, the next thing that the comprehensive plan has for us is an inventory of what a city already owns. And it can say, great, we need a bunch of stuff and we've already got it, or, oops, we're short and what do we do next? So then the comprehensive plan takes us to the next step and it says, well, what kind of projects would you need to build in order to meet the unmet needs? And by the way, how much are those going to cost? And last but not least, can we afford it? One of the requirements of the Growth Management Act is that there be a financing plan in the comp plan update and in the original comp plan. And if you find that you've got plenty of money, you're set. But if you're not fully funded, then the last step is to either circle back to the land use element and revisit what your assumptions are, or change your levels of service, or you can turn to additional revenues. It might be the real estate excise tax, which was one of the few sources of revenue we got from the legislature in the Growth Management Act, or it could be the other one that they gave us, which is impact fees. So probably the first question I get asked about impact fees is, what is it? A simple definition is that it's a one-time payment, so whoever has to pay it only pays it once. And the who pays it is only new development. So if you've already got your house or your business, you're not going to pay it, but if you're going to build a new one, you would be subject to paying it. The next part of the definition is that what you're paying for is only for capital improvements. You're not being asked to pay for the operations of the park, but merely to acquire the park. You're not being asked to pay to sweep the streets, merely to build the streets. And last but not least, that new capital that you're paying for has to be needed by your new development. In other words, the law prohibits the impact fee from being used by a city to make up for a problem that already existed before your development took place. So impact fees can be attractive to cities for really two reasons. The first and most obvious is it involves bringing in new money to City Hall so that we can afford to pay for this necessary infrastructure. But some cities, in addition to or even almost in lieu of the need for money, are also acting on a policy that many cities have chosen to adopt. And that policy is when development happens, that's growth, and growth needs to pay for itself, or at least to pay for part of itself, and that the taxpayer should not be required to subsidize all of that cost. So in order for a city to decide whether or not it needs an impact fee, it really needs to ask itself four questions. The first is, are we growing? Because you can only have impact fees in a growth environment. And if you're not growing, or you're growing very slowly, and yet you're still covered by the Growth Management Act and you have to do all this planning, but if there isn't much growth, probably impact fees are not for you. But if you've passed the first test, you're growing, then the next question is, do we need, because of that growth, additional infrastructure? Do we need more streets, more parks, more water and sewer lines, and more fire stations? And if so, then having passed that second test, we would ask the third question, do we have enough money to pay for those, or do we not have enough money? Because if we don't, then we're really a candidate for an impact fee. And the last question is, if we are growing and we need facilities and we need money, we have to ask and answer the question, do we want to charge new development for that? Or are we willing to charge our existing residents and taxpayers? If you've answered all 4 of those, we're growing, we need infrastructure, we don't have enough money, and we want growth to help pay for this, then you're a good candidate for an impact fee. So when the Growth Management Act was passed, and the legislature understood that cities were being asked to do some very serious planning about things that could be very expensive, all these parks and streets and fire stations and the like, they gave us a specific list of things that we could charge impact fees for, and they left some other things off the list. So let's talk about what those are. On the yes side of the equation, a city can charge impact fees for roads and streets. We all have taken to calling that our transportation system, but it really doesn't allow us to charge for bike paths and sidewalks and transit systems, but definitely the roads and streets. Second thing we're allowed to charge impact fees for is parks and recreational facilities. The third thing we can charge is for fire stations and fire trucks, the apparatus that you need. And the fourth and final one in the Growth Management Act is for schools, which is interesting because cities don't provide schools. So we partner with our school districts, and they tell us what we need, and then the city adopts those needs into their comprehensive plan, and then would adopt the impact fee, collect the money, because the city government's the one that's interacting with the developer, but the money would then be given to the school district. Now, water and sewer facilities can also be charged a kind of an impact fee. We use different language for it, and it comes under a law that pre-existed the Growth Management Act. There are things like plan investment fees or capital facilities fees. But as a practical matter, I think it's safe for a city to assume it has the ability to charge that, even though it's not called that under the Growth Management Act. Where this leaves us is the things that cities cannot charge impact fees for. Police stations, no luck. You need to improve your public workshops, can't charge an impact fee for that. Need a new city hall or expand the one you're in? Can't help you there. You operate your local library system, no impact fees allowed. Gone blank. Oh, and most cities have, or many cities have a court system, and that may or may not be part of City Hall, and unfortunately the judicial system and the courts are not allowed as part of the impact fees. So the legislature limited the types of things we can charge impact fees for. The legislature also put some other limits on impact fees, and they are, first, we cannot charge for operations. So if we build the street, we can't use the street sweepers to clean it. So operating expenses are off the table. Impact fees only can pay for the capital. Second, we cannot pay for capital that is fixing up something that's broken. So if we've got a park and it's got a ball field, and the ball field's got bleachers, but the bleachers are old wooden ones and they're falling down, and we need to fix them, we can't do that repair with impact fees. The one exception would be if a city is fixing something, and in the course of fixing it, it makes it bigger and better that does serve new development, then an impact fee can be used for part of that. But generally, the safest rule is no repairs, renovation, remodeling. Other things that you cannot do with impact fees, if you have an existing deficiency, so you've got too much traffic at a particular intersection, and you want to widen it and add a lane, but that problem already existed before any new development takes place, you're going to have to use other city money to fix that. You can't charge the new development for an impact fee to fix that. You are allowed to divide the costs. If part of the project takes care of an old problem and part of it adds capacity to take care of new development, we can split the cost and use city gas tax dollars or general fund or a bond issue or a grant for the city's share, the deficiency, and then the impact fee can pay for the growth share. Impact fees started slowly after the Growth Management Act was adopted. Cities weren't sure what they were supposed to do. They weren't sure what each other was going to do. They're afraid of being uncompetitive. If City 1 charges impact fees and City next door doesn't, first city thought maybe all the development would go next door. For a few cities that might have been attractive, but for most cities that wasn't something they were trying to accomplish. And so we've watched impact fees become more acceptable in the municipal community. And we have a really good piece of information about this. The Association of Washington Cities, every 2 years, does an amazing survey of all city governments, a lot of information about their finances and where the money comes from, fees and charges, and a whole host of things. And they've been asking for quite a few years about impact fees. The most recent survey was published in 2012, And as of that survey, there's almost 80, I think it's 78 cities that are now charging impact fees of one kind or another. So let's go back to those 4 types of impact fees that the growth management allows, and let's just see who's charging what. The most commonly charged impact fee is parks and recreation. 78 cities are charging that. Almost as many cities, 73, are charging impact fees for roads and streets. Then it drops off quite a bit. The next most frequently charged is for schools, and it's only about 33 cities that are charging those, and then and then having to give the money to the school district, of course, because they're the ones that build the schools. And then the impact fee that is charged the least, although it's still more than a fourth of these cities, about 25 cities are charging impact fees for fire stations and fire trucks. A lot of cities have been really concerned about whether impact fees would have a counterproductive effect, that they would stop development, even though the Growth Management Act is about planning for and accommodating development, or that at least it would be a disincentive for development. And in the early days, in the early 90s, when the first few cities started adopting impact fees, there was a significant amount of concern about whether or not that unintended consequence might occur. But to me, the single proof, the best proof that impact fees don't stop development is the 78 cities that have adopted impact fees over the last 15 or 20 years. That's a lot of cities. They continued to have significant growth. The growth didn't go somewhere else. The proof of that is they've collected millions of dollars that they've used to build the streets, buy the parks, improve the fire stations, and help with the schools. So without looking into a fancy economic study of whether or not development is affected by impact fees, we just have the practical fact that cities that are charging impact fees are still seeing significant development. I think the reason that that turned out to be true, that development didn't go someplace else, is primarily because the impact fees, even though they may be hundreds of dollars, in some cases even thousands of dollars, compared to the cost of the development itself, a office building for millions of dollars, a house for $100,000 or $200,000, those fees turn out to be a very small piece of the total cost, and it turned out not to drive development away. And added to that, there's a real understanding by the people paying the fees ultimately that they're getting value for those dollars. It's not just going into a general fund of the city where it disappears and we don't know what we get for it. If a new home builder pays an impact fee for that new house, that house is going to get the streets or the parks or the schools or the fire station that it needs. And I think that really overcomes the notion of, gee, an extra fee is going to make me look for someplace else to develop. If impact fees don't discourage development, then are there factors that cities need to be aware of that do discourage development? Or does development always just want to come to every city? And I think the reason that development does make hard decisions about, I'll move my business to your city and not to somebody else's, or I'll buy my home in your city and not somebody else's, isn't the impact fee, which is very small, but there are very, very important factors that do affect development. The first and most important factor, and it's beyond the control of any city council, is the national and state economy. When economies are strong and people are buying things and employment is high, then the economy is robust and development happens. But when it's a weak economy, like we've just come out of in the Great Recession, it isn't impact fees that are stopping development. It's people don't have jobs, people aren't spending money, and so the housing market really suffers as a result of that. There are some other factors that are probably less important, but they're more important than impact fees, that that affect a developer's decision whether or not to move into a particular community. The availability of a good labor force, access to people who are going to be good workers, the quality of the school system is often very, very important. Whether or not the city has got other resources that it can put to work besides impact fees to bring in good infrastructure. Amazingly enough, for a new business or a business moving into town from somewhere else, if the headquarters is going to move into your town, it turns out that the economic studies show that one of the biggest factors is, where does the chief executive want to live? And that doesn't have anything to do with impact fees, and there's not a lot that a city can do about that except the thing it does best: make the city an attractive place to live with a good government, with good quality programs, and that's what brings people to town. A city that is thinking about charging impact fees has to consider whether or not it needs impact fees, the kind of rules that I talked about earlier of, are we growing and do we need infrastructure and so forth. But it also needs to think about, even though impact fees don't generally drive away businesses or stop development, there's really a special issue in the minds of most city council members about what do our homegrown small businesses do when they want to expand. And our small home builders, the folks that are independent, building one or two a year. How do we make sure that even though in the national scheme of things, impact fees don't drive away development, we don't want to hurt the local businesses? And so there are some things, not very many under Washington law, but there are a few things that a city council can think about and that it can do to help protect local businesses. First, what you cannot do is you cannot set aside a special category called small businesses and exempt them from these fees. The state's very particular about what exemptions are allowed. And really the only one that is allowed, and this will help some small home builders, is the legislature allows the city to exempt low-income housing. It allows the city to define what that means, and then it allows the developer of that low-income housing to not pay the fee. But it's not a free lunch, because the law says that if the city exempts the builder from paying it, the city has to write the check. So the impact fee account is still going to get the money, and it has to come out of the city's general fund or some other source of money. But at least that takes the pressure off of that small home builder. There's a couple of other things that a city could think about doing that have to affect all impact fee payers, not just the small folks, but it will help the small folks. One is, if you're going to start adopting an impact fee, you don't have to adopt the whole amount right away. You could phase it in over a series of years. A good recent example is the city of Renton that had some very old impact fees, and an update led to a major increase, and they didn't want to hit the market with all of that increase in 1 year. So they took a 3 or 4 year time period to grow the fees over time, and that also helped the small businesses, because the ones that developed in the first few years would have a cheaper fee, the ones that waited till later would have a more expensive fee. And then there's always the possibility for the city to just reduce the rates across the board and charge less than your experts tell you or your staff tells you. The problem with that is you have to find a way to pay for that. You can't just charge less and then imagine you're going to get the other money. And so you're either going to have to reduce your project list, and that means lower levels of service, or you're going to have to charge somebody else for the money you're missing, and that tends to put the burden back on the taxpayers that you were trying to help out by making growth pay for itself. I think it's important for a city to understand how that connects to impact fees and how impact fees connect back to those updates of the plan. I want to talk about this in two different groups, because either your city does not have impact fees, and I'd like to talk about how that relates to your comp plan update, or your city does have impact fees, and I'd like to talk a little how it's a little different how that effect happens. So first, let's talk about a city that does not now have impact fees, but is about to undertake a major improvement and update of its comprehensive plan. For those cities, and if you're one of those cities, it means that your comprehensive plan is going to have fresh new growth forecasts. It's going to have a fresh revisit of the levels of service. It's going to rethink what the needs are for new facilities. You may need a lot more than you thought in the past. You may need less, but you're going to have a fresh look at that. And you're going to be required in your capital facilities element update to look at the financing and to find out if you have enough money to pay for these things that you need. If your city finds as part of this update that it doesn't have enough money, then you've got a couple of choices. You can either cut the costs, but cutting the costs means eliminating projects. Eliminating projects means you're probably not going to achieve your level of service. And not achieving your level of service doesn't just affect new development. That level of service applies to everybody in your city. So if you'd rather not do that, then another alternative is to look for more revenue so that you can keep all the projects. And new revenue, if you don't have an impact fee now, could include the development of an impact fee, and that would be a direct link back to your updated plan. Now let me talk to cities, or talk about cities, that have impact fees, and you're updating your comprehensive plans. You're going to also be updating your growth data, your level of service information, the inventory of what you own, and your financing plan. But in the case of a city that already has an impact fee, The update will teach you and help you and your staff understand whether you need to decrease that fee or increase that fee. And in some cases, maybe you had a fee for transportation but not parks, or for fire but not schools. This opportunity from updating the plan will give you that chance to revisit whether you'd like to add a fee or subtract a fee or change its amount. When a city adopts an impact fee, it's not done by staff or the mayor or the city manager. It's done with the approval of the elected officials of the city council. And so I'd like to talk for a minute about what city council's role is in the development of the impact fee, because it's critical, not just because it's the yes or no, but there's a lot of really important policy decisions that go into this. Let's start with what happens before the city council gets the technical information. Like any issue that comes to a city council, somebody, typically on staff or a consultant who's an expert in the field, has done some homework and presents a report or a study or a PowerPoint presentation, something that helps the council understand what has gone into this calculation. Now, for an impact fee, the city staff or the expert consultant has to make sure that these calculations that go to the city council will comply with the Growth Management Act legal requirements. And there's 3 or 4 pages of those in the revised Code of Washington, or RCW as we call it. And if you're looking to read up on that yourself, you'd want to go to RCW section 82.02.050. And it'll tell you everything you wanted to know about state law on impact fees. And if you have insomnia, it'll help cure that too. After the staff and the consultants have delivered the study to the council, now we get to talk about what the council gets to do. First, the council is going to review the study and understand it, ask questions of the staff and the consultant in order to decide whether it's even a good idea and whether it's unexpectedly high or surprisingly low. And probably the council is going to ask questions like, doesn't this affect development? Doesn't it discourage development? And some of the other issues that we've talked about. But the council can also, and most councils do, decide to seek public input. It may be in the form of a hearing for the adoption of an ordinance. It might be an open house or a series of community meetings or speaking at local civic groups. But one way or another, a lot of cities feel that an impact fee decision has a real effect on the community, that it will be seen by different parts of the community in different ways, and want the community to understand that. Now the council gets to make the big decision, adopt or not adopt the impact fee, and in the course of doing that, here are some other things that the city council gets to weigh in on and really controls the choice. Should the fee be adopted at the amount that the technical people have said it could be adopted, or should it be less than that? You're not required to charge the maximum allowable amount that the staff and consultants present you. As we've talked about earlier, if you choose to charge less, you are going to have to think about how to reduce your costs or increase your other revenues, but you always have that right to charge less than the full amount. You also have the right to make a decision about when this all kicks in. You could, for example, phase in the rates and charge half of your final rate the first year and then 75% the next year and then the full amount the third year, just as an example, much like Renton has done. You could choose, like the city of Edmonds did recently with its park impact fee, to exempt low-income housing. In Edmonds' case, they decided that their most serious provider of low-income housing are nonprofit organizations. And so they're only offering the exemption to a nonprofit group such as Habitat for Humanity. And they're willing to write the check on behalf of that organization and put the money into the impact fee account so that Habitat doesn't have to do that. So it's City Council's decision whether or not to create that exemption, and if so, who receives it, and by the way, where's the city going to get the money to pay for that? So one other policy decision that the City Council should be making is most city ordinances, when a City Council adopts them, take effect very, very quickly, the next morning or 5 days later. Depends a lot on some state laws and the specific nature of the ordinance. But a lot of things cities do can take effect really, really soon. Impact fees have been an interesting lesson on this issue, and I think cities that are considering impact fees should take this to heart, what other cities have learned. You might have the right to adopt this fee and put it into effect in a few days, but in the development business, somebody who's going to walk in tomorrow and pull a building permit has probably been doing planning for that building permit for months. They've had architects drawing up the drawings, they've been figuring out what their financing is, what the price is going to be, they're entering into contracts with buyers. And here we are in 24 hours or 1 week suddenly adding hundreds or thousands of dollars to the expense of that development that they didn't anticipate. What many cities have done in order to solve that problem, and you're allowed to do this because it isn't an exemption, it's a delayed implementation, and that's to set the effective date 2 or 3 or even 4 months later. So the stuff that's in the pipeline can get finished, and then the folks who can see it coming and can build the costs into their pro formas can understand that it's going to be their responsibility to pay. A city that is seriously thinking about impact fees or is seriously considering a noticeable increase in impact fees can kind of take its own temperature, can get a sense of whether or not this is a direction to head into by looking at 2 or 3 things. The first is the city growing? We talked about that before, but the question this time is it growing faster than its ability to pay for the things it needs for growth? Because some cities do have a remarkable growth in their tax base, and they can keep up with that. But you're probably a good candidate for an impact fee if you've got growth, and the growth is faster than the growth in your tax base and the revenues that you get. The second thing is a city needs to deal with this question of whether or not impact fees are a disincentive or they drive development away. And I think understanding that 80 cities in Washington have been charging impact fees for years and development didn't go away, and they collected millions of dollars to help pay for their parks and streets, their fire stations and their schools, is, I think, going to give great comfort to a city that's now considering embarking on impact fees for the first time, or even considering a major increase, because we have some cities now with impact fees that are very significant. Probably the highest one in the state for transportation is the city of Sammamish. It's in the vicinity of $14,000 or $15,000 for a single family house. And yet, single-family house construction didn't stop in Sammamish. The city of Sammamish found, and the developers in Sammamish found, they need to pay that to get the streets that those houses need. And so it's been agreed to. In fact, amazingly enough, the Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish County actually gave a letter to the city indicating they never really like impact fees, and they didn't like this one either, but they had put the entire methodology under their microscope, and they agreed that it was done properly and that they would not challenge it. The last thing that we need to consider is whether or not the payment for these new facilities that we know we need should come at least in part from growth, or whether growth shouldn't have to pay. That's a policy decision that cities need to undertake. So I've been talking for quite some time here about the impact fees that are authorized under the Growth Management Act, because we're very conscious of the update of the comprehensive plans that are coming around, and our initial thought was, well, how would cities think about funding those improvements, and impact fees are clearly one of them. But we shouldn't forget that cities had the authority to require development to mitigate its effects on the public infrastructure before the Growth Management Act passed. It was done under SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act, and it allowed a city to say, you are affecting our streets, our park systems are being affected by you, and to require the development to, the word we used was to mitigate those effects. Now, sometimes that mitigation took the form of a payment, so it began to look like an impact fee, and sometimes it was, in fact, rather frequently, it was in the form of the developer saying, well, I'll donate the land for your park, or I'll widen the street in front of my office building. Let's talk for a minute about the differences between a GMA or Growth Management Act impact fee and the mitigation that a city can get under a SEPA, because there are quite a few cities still using SEPA very successfully, but there are some pluses and minuses to both ways of doing this. For SEPA, there's a low development threshold, typically a short plat, but it's often four houses or less, or 9 houses or less, or 9 lots or fewer, but there's a threshold below which SEPA does not apply. And if you use SEPA to get your mitigation, the good news is that means those small developments are protected from mitigation, and that's one way to accommodate the small businesses. The bad news is those small businesses and small developments are exempt from mitigation, and they're not helping to take care of the impacts that they really are creating on the streets and the parks and the fire station. So, it's a tough question about whether that's the best way to mitigate. The other 2 things to think about, in my mind, for SEPA, first, SEPA outcomes are unpredictable. They require a case-by-case review of each development, and the developer doesn't know what's going to be asked of her or him, and the city's not quite sure what they're going to get. And only when they finish the studies and do the negotiations do we know what it's going to cost. The advantage, particularly to larger developers, of a pre-published impact fee schedule under the Growth Management Act is they can look up on the chart and say, oh, for every square foot of office building, I need to pay $1.50. And they can plan that in advance and not find out later that the SEPA program was going to only cost them 50 cents or it was going to cost them $50. Let's start with what a developer does first as they're thinking about whether or not to go forward with a particular project. They're going to do a form of financial analysis that the jargon in the business is a pro forma. It is a set of formulas or spreadsheets or calculations in which the developer puts in their costs. How much is it going to cost me for the land? How about the materials to build this building? How about the labor to construct it? And they're going to be looking at regulatory costs. Is the city government charging me certain things? The developer is also interested in how quickly all this happens because, pardon the trite phrase, but time is money. And the longer you make the developer wait, the more it's costing them in lost opportunity or even in money that's sitting borrowed and they're paying interest on it. And so as the developer is looking at your city and thinking, should I come there or should I go somewhere else, it can actually come back to comprehensive plan tools like impact fees, where if the impact fee is a known number and the applicant doesn't have to do a special study to figure out SEPA impacts, they can plug the known number in their pro forma, and they know how quickly they can get to the table with you and get their permits. As cities get ready to update their comprehensive plans and development regulations, one of the elements they'll be looking at is the capital facilities element. And the statutes lay out pretty clearly some things that you have to do, and most of the city plans I've seen do a pretty good job of accomplishing all those things. You have to do an inventory of what you own so you know what you've got. You have to take into account what your growth forecasts are and come up with some kind of a metric or a level of service standard so that you can use that with the growth information to predict how many more acres of park or how many more miles of road you're going to need. And you have to come up with projects and you have to come up with a funding plan. Cities that do all of that have done the minimum and they've done a good service for their city. But there are important implications, and many of our cities have come to understand this, and they're extending or expanding their research either in the plan document or as a series of parallel studies, looking at things like what is going to happen to my operating budget after the comp plan is adopted. Let's say the comp plan says I need another 10 acres of parks, and we even figure out how to buy those park acres. Once we've bought them and we put the playgrounds and the ball fields on them, they don't take care of themselves. Where are we going to get the employees who are going to take care of the landscaping and the mowing? Where are the other employees going to come who are going to schedule the use of those ball fields? How much do they cost? How are we going to pay for them? These are all impacts, not like impact fees, but they're impacts on a city budget that are very real. And this is an opportunity, in my opinion, it's a necessity for a city to say, as we look at our capital investment, let's make sure that we're going to have the operating budget capacity to sustain those capital costs.